Hello, welcome to Wally War, and just in case you're wondering what I'm doing, other than just planing the edge of a door, what I'm actually doing is I'm actually putting a leading edge on the door. Now the idea of a leading edge is to provide some clearance. So when the door is in a closed position, the face of the door, the gaps on the face of the door becomes, well, they on the opening side it is are nice and tight, so not too big a gaps, but there's some clearance behind the gap. Now I'll try and explain what I mean by that and what I mean by putting a leading edge on a door. So let's get to it. Right, what we have here, we have a door. This is a stable door that I've just knocked up for somebody. It's in oak and it's a traditional style frame. If you're using the stormproof profile that you'd get on like UPVC type windows and doors, what have you, where the frame kind of overlaps, or so the door itself overlaps the frame a little bit, well then they don't put a leading edge on that kind of door. But when you have a traditional rebated frame like these are, just an ordinary rebate with a, with a water channel in it, what have you, very simple frame, you have to allow for the fact that the actual distance from corner to corner is longer than the width. So if I was to explain that, I have a bit of wood here. Now think of this being the bottom of the door. We know, if you're doing Pythagoras theorem and what have you, that this distance here, and that's measuring at 62 millimetres, that is, metric, sorry, and the distance from corner to corner is 63. So when we actually have our door mounted on its hinges in a frame, we know that when it's hinging from here, as the door tries to come down and shut, the bottom edge of the door is at risk of hitting the frame if it's a tight fit. So you have two options. You either make the door a lot narrower than what it's supposed to be, so there's a big gap either side so the door can shut without any kind of obstruction. But instead what we do is we put a leading edge. It's quite a traditional thing to do. People have been doing it for donkey's years. So it's nothing unusual. So all I'm doing by putting, how I'm putting a leading edge on this top section of this door set, it's this old stable door, it's only opening as well actually, on the house, which is unusual. And so what I'm actually doing is, I'm actually putting an angle on the closing face of the door. And by doing that, I'm creating some clearance, and also in theory, by making an angle, I'll get a square. Where's my squares gone? Little ones, that'll do. Sorry, I've got a square. So for instance, this one here, I've already put the leading edge on this door with my number 7 Bailey plane, and there is a very small gap under the one edge. Let's see if you can see that. Come down here. There is a gap underneath that edge, just behind that back edge. You see it's rocking on there. Right, and that is the closing edge of the door. So that's the door, part of the door that makes contact, or shouldn't actually make contact, well it does, it makes contact with the frame first. By doing that leading edge, if I kind of show you on my little bit of wood here, by actually planing a very slight angle on the end, that's exaggerated obviously, the distance, which is from that point to that point in the middle of the door, in theory should be the same, or even slightly smaller, than from that point here, for which you put your leading edge on, to the opposite face. So the opposite leading edge, or this is the back edge, sorry. So that way it can't actually, when it's mounted on its hinges, it can't actually bind on the frame. Now you can see from there the angle there. As that angle comes down and almost makes contact with the frame, you can see that the angle is almost vertical. It's almost parallel with the angle, this angle here, of the actual frame itself, and then it doesn't actually bind. But that's not the only reason why we put a leading edge on our door. We can do it for other reasons as well. Some of it is going to be down to your hinge choice. And in this case, these old French hinges, they're like a drop-on hinge. Let's just take that off the edge so you can see. So what we have is, we have the bottom part of the hinge, and we have the top part of the hinge, and that drops onto there like so, and that makes your hinge. You can all open and close. These are very simple hinges, very popular in France. And when you have these together, there'll be a very small, if they're parallel with each other, there'll be a tiny gap, and it's only, what, you know, 1/16 of an inch or 1mm gap, that's all it is. The problem with that is, if you're, for instance, using slightly, well, screws that have heads a bit on the big side, like for instance, if you want, I'm using stainless steel screws on this door, and I can't get the screw heads of the right size. So what I'm going to actually have to do, I'm going to countersink these, so the screw heads are actually flush with the actual hinge itself. And you want them to be flush, because when that hinge comes together in a closed position, you don't want those heads hitting each other. Really, it'd be more sensible for a hinge to have staggered holes, really. They shouldn't really be in line. That shouldn't be maybe further up or slightly down, just slightly staggered. And then you haven't got the risk of them actually hitting each other. Now the problem when your door, the fixings in your hinges hit each other, the actual door bind. And if you probably notice, if you shut a door and it sort of springs back at you, that is most likely because the door is binding somehow. It's either binding because you haven't put a leading edge on, or it's binding because you haven't allowed the clearance of the screws. The other way of doing this, and the old way when we do the old butt hinges, the square butt hinges, quite obvious, quite popular in the UK. We'd cut the hinge, sometimes cut the hinge back a little bit. So we're creating the clearance that we need for the screws by actually chopping the hinge at a slight angle into the wood more than the face. So obviously, the edge which you need the actual to be a nice neat gap, that has to be just shy of the surface when you put your hinge mortise in. But the back face can be chopped back a little bit. It's not necessarily this type of hinge because they're narrow, whereas the old butt hinges are quite wide. Now, so you still need to obviously put a leading edge on your door to create that clearance for the door to close. But on the whole, it's very useful to actually put the leading edge also, so the actual hinges themselves automatically get more clearance because you put an angle on the door, and the points of where the actual hinge can make contact with each other, each side of the hinge make contact because of the screws and what have you, is less likely. So, advice to you, if you're fitting a door, let's say for instance it's an internal door, like your lounge and what have you, and it's in a door lining or a typical frame, my advice to you would be to obviously put a leading edge on your door. If your doors come as a set with its frame, I think quite often in the United States they have that. I mean, you buy a door and set, and they do in France to be honest. But in the UK, that's not how we fit doors in England. We fit a door lining, and then we'd mount the door within the door lining, and then trim up the architraves and stuff like that. My personal opinion, I think it looks a lot nicer. Aesthetically, I think it's much nicer, but it's a lot more work. Instead of creating a hole and then screwing the door and the hinge and the frame, everything into the hole, all ready to go, obviously it's a lot easier. But yes, so if you're fitting a door, just a square blank type door, or any door within a traditional frame or a traditional UK type style door lining, or just a plain and simple rebated frame of any type, you need to put a leading edge on the door, because you have to remember that the distance from corner to corner is greater than the width. Right, from there to there, so that corner here to that corner, opposite corner, is longer than the square end to that square end. So we put the leading edge on to even out, or to make it less of an obstruction when you close the door. Anyway, I hope you liked the video. I hope that was clear. Probably not. Anyway, if you'd be most kind, give us a like and subscribe, and maybe click the little bell icon, because then you get a warm fuzzy thing in your pocket. That'd be me uploading a video, and I know you'd be excited about that. Well, I hope you would be anyway. Anyway, leave it in the comments. Thank you for watching. I can do it with my stick. I need a finger on the end of my stick. No, that didn't work. Yeah.